Hello and happy holidays. If it's your first time tuning in, then welcome. And if you're a loyal subscriber, then welcome back. Career Relaunch is all about career change, where we feature interviews with inspiring people who have bravely stepped off the beaten path to pursue more meaningful work. My name is Joseph Liu, and I'm the host of Career Relaunch. Now, since it's mid-December and everyone's probably getting ready to close things down at work for the year and unplug a bit, today's episode's going to be a little different. There's no guest interview today because we're taking a little bit of a break for the holidays, but I did want to check in and share a few thoughts with you before the end of the year. The first thing I want to do is thank you for being a listener. Listeners like you are the reason why I really enjoy producing this show. We've come to the end of season 1, and I hope you've gained some useful insights from the first 10 episodes of Career Relaunch. My hope is that these stories provide you with a little bit of clarity during your own career journey. Now, with the holidays upon us and the end of the year right around the corner, I know you're probably super busy right now wrapping things up at work so you can spend some quality time with your friends, family, and loved ones. But I did want to take a few minutes today to cover 3 things with you. First, 3 career lessons I've learned myself from the first 10 episodes. Second, I thought I'd give you an update on the show and my plans for the future. And finally, I have a request and favor to ask of you. Okay, first, those 3 career lessons I've learned myself. One thing I always encourage my clients to do at the end of the year is to reflect on where they've been and where they want to go. So I thought I would do the same with this episode and start by sharing my own key takeaways and reflections from the first 10 episodes, having listened to them many, many times myself. Now, there are 3 key takeaways related to career change that I've walked away with myself. The first is that making a career change is really tough, but it can be done. I don't think a single one of my guests just coasted into their new careers, whether it's changing industries or companies or starting your own business. Changing careers presents all sorts of practical challenges, but half of the battle is dealing with your own emotional challenges. Most of the guests we've featured were on some sort of an emotional roller coaster as they tried to figure out where to take their careers. I recently wrote an article in Fast Company called 3 Self-Limiting Beliefs I Had to Shake Before Becoming My Own Boss. And it was basically an article about dealing with my own doubts about myself, like my own insecurities about whether I was on the right track toward success. And the point is that a lot of times we can be our own worst enemies. The second lesson I've learned from our guests is that you don't have to get things exactly right the first time. You just need to take manageable steps in the right direction. I was listening last month to a press conference that President Barack Obama in the US was giving a week after the presidential election, which I'm still kind of processing. And he was talking about this concept of making progress, which really resonated with me. He said, "Perfect is unattainable, but better is possible." Now, regardless of whether you're a fan of Obama's or not, the idea here is that you don't need to strive for perfection. You can strive for improvement, even if those improvements are really small. Sometimes taking those big steps are just too daunting, but a lot of our guests talked about taking really small steps that eventually culminated in the big changes they wanted to make for their lives. But it didn't happen overnight, and it was messy along the way, and at the same time, you just got to force yourself to start somewhere. The last thing I've taken away is that it makes a lot of sense when you're feeling confused or uncertain about what to do to just trust your instincts, to listen to your intuition because it often tells you what you need to do. You may remember a lot of our guests talking about things that just suddenly felt right or finally dawned on them that they were tapping into a passion or a long-held interest. You've got to find some way to step back from the craziness of each day and reflect a little bit on what your inner voice is telling you, what's really important for your life. One of my favorite books is by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And he says in that book, quote, "Insight is not a light bulb that goes off inside our heads. It's a flickering candle that can easily be snuffed out." And he talks about how decisions made very quickly can be every bit as good as decisions made cautiously and deliberately. That, quote, "There can be as much value in the blink of an eye as in months of rational analysis." So my hope is that this podcast can help you clarify what your gut's telling you. to help you listen to those flickering candles inside you. And if those flickering candles inside you keep nagging you, it means it's time to take action. Okay, so those are the 3 themes that stood out to me from the first 10 episodes, and hopefully they give you some food for thought as you go off into the holidays and think about how you want 2017 to shape up for you. The second thing I wanted to cover with you today was an update on the show. Now, this podcast has been a little bit of an experiment for me and my own little side hustle. I've never done a podcast before, but a lot of my clients going through career change were telling me that just hearing examples of how other people navigate change can be really useful to them. So I created this podcast as a way of reaching people out there who are struggling with their career or in a process of relaunching their careers, especially since stepping off the beaten path can sometimes be confusing and even lonely at times. This podcast is something I do when I have time between the career change and personal branding talks, workshops, and coaching work I do for my clients. So when I set off to do this last year, I wasn't 100% sure how long I would keep doing it. But so far, the feedback from listeners has been really positive. Here's a voicemail from a listener in Auckland, New Zealand, who was kind enough to share her thoughts on the podcast.
I started listening to the Career Relaunch podcast a couple of months ago after coming across Joseph Liu's article on how to be your own boss, which was published on the Fast Company website. And followed up to see that he had a podcast, and I've been listening to it ever since. I think one of the things that I really, really enjoy about it is how candid and open his guests are on the podcast about the decision to change their career path and the challenges that they faced, the emotions that they went through during this transition phase. And they also talk a lot about how they overcame some of these challenges, which I find really useful. I really resonate with some of these philosophies, and I'm trying to incorporate some of these into my own life.
So thank you so much, Neelam, for being a subscriber and taking the time to record that message. We do try to be really candid and open on this show about both the challenges and how to overcome those challenges. So I'm glad you're finding these stories to be useful. I've had a lot of people actually share positive feedback with me on the podcast. So I'm going to keep making more episodes in 2017. And at the same time, I'm going to be making 2 changes to the show. First, you might remember me giving away worksheets at the end of each episode, and I may not be doing that for every single episode moving forward, but I'll still be capturing show notes for each episode. And second, the show is going to move from being a weekly and bi-weekly podcast to a slightly less frequent podcast, maybe something like once or twice a month. Now, when I started this podcast, all the experts out there told me you got to do a weekly podcast, and I would love to do that, but I just feel like it's becoming a little bit too crammed for both me and my listeners, so we're going to slow the cadence down just a little bit. Okay, so season 2 will be airing the first week of January, and I've got some really interesting guests in season 2 for you. We are going to kick off with someone from London who is a former corporate lawyer turned clinical psychologist, and we're also going to be featuring a former Army sniper turned children's magician. So I hope you'll enjoy listening to those episodes and others we have lined up. In the meantime, I have 2 requests for you. First, I'd love to get your feedback on the show. I want to make sure I'm making this podcast as useful as possible to you, so I'd love to hear from you. If you have something you like about the show, like what you heard earlier from Neelam in New Zealand, or something you don't like about the show, a question you want to ask me, or a particular career challenge or topic you want covered, I'd love for you to leave me a voicemail. For example, here's Neelam again and the rest of her message.
I think going forward, it'd be interesting to hear more about people who aren't necessarily entrepreneurs or running their own business, but are facing similar challenges around changing their career path inside larger organizations and some of the challenges that they would face similarly whilst changing their career focus. Look forward to hearing the podcast down the track, and thank you so much.
So that's not a bad idea, Neelam, and maybe we'll try to feature some people who are still in large organizations who have changed careers, because I know that we haven't done as much of that on the show so far. So I'll definitely keep that in mind. Okay, so if you want to leave me a message, all you have to do is go to careerrelaunch.net/voicemail and record a message for me there. You can also just leave me a comment, but I definitely prefer voice recording because I love hearing from my listeners, and I might even air your voice on a future episode. Again, that's careerrelaunch.net/voicemail. If you prefer, you can also email me at joseph@careerrelaunch.net with your comments. Finally, if you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate you taking a couple minutes after you hear this episode to write a positive review for me on iTunes. It only takes a couple minutes, and when you write a positive review for the podcast and share the podcast with others, it does three things. First, it builds the show's visibility in iTunes. Second, it helps others understand this is a high-quality show that's legitimately helpful. And most importantly, it helps build up our community of like-minded people who aspire to do more meaningful work. So just go to careerrelaunch.net/review, where you can find some simple instructions on how to do this. Again, that's careerrelaunch.net/review. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. I know there are a lot of podcasts out there that you can listen to, and I really appreciate you choosing this one. So thank you for subscribing to this show and being a loyal listener. Have a wonderful rest of the holiday season, a happy new year, and be sure to give yourself a break. I'll be back with you in a couple weeks, and in the meantime, I really hope to hear from you.